Events prior to my death. Many events of great spiritual significance took place just prior to my death, which are excellent examples of the great cosmic laws in action within your dimension of existence. I am now giving you a brief account of those important events, since it is my purpose to enlighten your minds wholly, to give you knowledge beyond any knowledge yet received by any other person in your universe. When I began to prepare my disciples for my approaching death, it was an immensely difficult task. They could scarcely contain their shock and astonishment. The thought of my being crucified as an ordinary felon was repellent beyond words, and neither did they want to lose me from their midst. I had called them to follow me and leave behind their lives, which had been fairly prosperous. They had left their families and homes to rebuild their lives around me and my work. They had taken pride in my progress through the towns. They had been willing to be associated with me and to be known as my disciples, despite the rejection and harsh criticism of their religious leaders. Furthermore, they loved and respected me, both for the way I lived my own teachings and the way I had compassionately healed so many people and brought them comfort in their unhappy lives. They truly believed I was the Son of God. How could the Son of God end up on the cross? They asked each other. Their horror increased with each question. It was unthinkable. They felt a tremendous void opening up in front of them, a void in their lives and a huge crater in the earth on which they walked, and a vast expanse of instability and lack of purpose within themselves. What I told them about my future crucifixion, they dared not contemplate. Such an event would destroy everything they had believed in with all their hearts. Consequently, my disciples loudly and volubly resisted what I tried to tell them, and stated again and again that such a thing could never be. When I stood firm against their stubborn denials, they were eventually forced to quieten their arguments and outwardly accept that such a thing might be possible. I told them that after my death, they would see me again, and that I expected them to carry on the work I had started. The pain and argumentativeness I had aroused in my disciples also affected me deeply. It was no easy undertaking to go to Jerusalem where my fate awaited me. More than anything, I wondered how I would measure up to this great challenge of my endurance. Would I be able to transcend the physical condition and enter into universal Father consciousness and remain there until I died? At times I was deeply frightened of the ordeal, but I dared not reveal this fear to my disciples. Therefore, I began my last journey towards Jerusalem with powerfully mixed feelings. On the one hand, I was weary of healing and talking and teaching people who listened with open mouths and had no real understanding of anything I was trying to tell them. I had thought that my knowledge would enable people to climb out of their misery and at the very least make contact with the Father and gain a glimpse of the kingdom of heaven. There had been no evidence of such a spiritual awakening, even amongst my disciples. My disappointment and sense of failure made me glad to be moving on from this earth life to the glorious existence I knew awaited me after my death. At the same time, I wondered how I would endure the pain of the crucifixion. Throughout my mission, I had lived in a more or less consistently peaceful, frequently exalted state of mind, with my thoughts focused on the Father Love Consciousness, author of all being, knowing that I had but to ask, and what I asked for would swiftly manifest itself. Would I be able to keep my equanimity when brought before the council, when led out to my crucifixion, when nailed to the cross with my weight hanging from my hands? Because I was now giving way to doubts and fears, the normal level of my consciousness frequencies were dropping. They were taking me down into the frequencies of the earth plane consciousness. I became a prey again to my old aggression, prompting me to unreasonable actions I would never have contemplated earlier, when in my former state of total harmony with the Father Love Consciousness. My doubts and conflicts externalized in my life as human emotions and impulses which contravened the cosmic law of love. First, there was the episode of the fig tree. I was hungry and went to the tree not really expecting to find fruit, because it was not the right season for figs. When my search was unfruitful, I cursed the fig tree. 24 hours later, it was shriveled to its roots. It was a shocking experience. It was the first time my words had caused harm to anything. However, it clearly demonstrated for my disciples the power of thought for good or evil. It showed them that the more spiritually evolved a person is, the greater is the impact of their words on the environment. I took the opportunity to point out to my disciples that I had thoughtlessly behaved as does the average man or woman who, when having high expectations, cannot get what they want. They usually react with anger, tears, hostility, and even sharp words, which might or might not amount to a kind of ill-wishing or cursing of the person who has denied them their heart's desire. They had now seen for themselves what my cursing had done to the fig tree. They should now be able to understand that whilst a strong conviction would bring about anything they might desire and imagine, they must also be constantly aware of their own mental emotional condition. They must not harbor resentment against others, but must swiftly forgive. Otherwise, they could do much damage to those they resented, which damage would return to them in due course as a harvest of their sowing. Furthermore, as one sows, so does one reap. I knew that what I had done to the fig tree would inevitably return to me in one form or another. I took my disciples to the temple. It was many years since I had been there, and I knew my visit would serve to set in train the events which would lead to my crucifixion. Some of the people recognized me, and in response to their requests, I began to teach them. More people gathered and crowded the moneylenders, who began to complain. Their shouting and loud complaints broke my train of thought as I was teaching. Suddenly my wrath was aroused. Here were people earnestly gathered around me, wanting to hear the words of life, which soon I would not be able to speak to them. And there were the moneylenders, who made their lives by selling livestock for sacrifices, which did the people no good whatsoever. These men only brought people into debt and misery. I felt a rush of blood to my head, and I pushed the tables over, scattering their money, and I drove the money-hearted men out of the temple. Now there was a great commotion of shouting and screaming. Some people were scrambling to pick up the money. The money lenders were calling down curses on my head, denouncing me as evil, as one doing the work of Beelzebub and 1,000 other devils. The priests and Pharisees and all the people who set great store by the sacrifices in the temple came running together to find out the cause of the noise and confusion. On hearing the money lender's story, they were so outraged by my actions, they launched into vociferous condemnation of me, and lamentations to impress the priests, each one making louder protest than their neighbors, to demonstrate their horror at what I had done. Such a thing had never been seen in the temple before. Even those who had previously listened to me were now disturbed at my willfulness and wondered what kind of man I might be. They were standing close together, watching the proceedings, when they were noticed and approached by the priests and Pharisees, who persuaded them I was trying to destroy all they had believed in, preaching a false god entirely unlike anything they had ever heard about in their synagogues. The priests passed on their own outraged anger to the people and convinced them that my sin would contaminate them also if they persisted in listening to my madness. Gradually, the people were persuaded I was an evil influence and should be removed before I could disrupt the peace of the country and bring down the wrath of the Roman governor on the entire country of Palestine. My disciples, ashamed of what I had done, quietly left the scene and hid amongst the alleys some way from the temple. When they returned to me later, they clearly showed they were also sorely tried by my actions. They wondered whether I had taken leave of my senses, gone mad, prophesying my death, and then doing those very things which would probably be the cause of it. It was at that time that Judas, who had never fully shed his Jewish beliefs, began to doubt whether I was the Messiah after all. 3 years I had taught the people, and there was no lessening of the Roman rule. 3 years, and people were no nearer the happiness I had promised them. And now it seemed that I was about to become a disturber of the peace, bringing down the wrath of Rome on their heads. He heard that the Jewish high priest wanted to get rid of me, and so he offered his services to identify my person when required to do so. When it was time for me to eat the Passover with my disciples, I arranged we should eat it all together in a large supper room. I knew it would be the last time I would eat any food on earth. I do not want to return deeply to the consciousness of that night. I felt great sadness to be leaving my disciples who had served me so well. With my sadness came a return of all my fears and conflicts. I had moments of deep emotional self-pity. I felt that no one understood all I had tried to do for my people and the sacrifice I was prepared to make for them. John was giving a vivid account of the story of the Israelites last night in Egypt, before they escaped into the desert. He spoke of Moses' instructions to the head of each family to kill an unblemished lamb, to cook it in a certain way, and paint its blood on the doorposts of all Israelite dwellings, because that very night angels would come and slaughter all the firstborn children of the Egyptians and their livestock. With great relish, he recalled the outcry made by the Egyptians when they woke to find the bloodied firstborn in every home. None was spared. It was the kind of horrible story I rejected as having any value for anyone seeking higher spiritual truth. I wondered how much my disciples had really understood when I spoke of their Heavenly Father and His love for all mankind. How could they relish the thought of angels killing the Egyptian firstborn when I had clearly told them that God, the Father, was love? But the Jews had always been preoccupied with the shedding of blood to atone for their sins. Even Abraham, the founder of the Israelite nation, had been convinced he should take his only son into the desert and kill and offer him as a sacrifice to God, a pagan and revolting thought. I thought of the animal sacrifices in the temple. Loving all the wild things of creation as I did, the practice was an abomination to me, and now I was about to be put to death because I had dared to speak the words of truth. And when I considered how little I had achieved in passing on my knowledge, I wondered why I had been sent on such a mission. I felt a momentary spasm of resentment and anger, interthreading my usual feelings of love for these men. With some cynicism, I wondered what effective token of remembrance I could leave with them, to bring back to their minds all my teachings when I was no longer with them. If they could so swiftly forget all my teachings on the Father's love and enjoy the horrible story of the Passover whilst I was still in the room with them, how much would they remember when I had died as a felon on the cross, the most despicable of deaths? Then it came to me that since they were so moved by the shedding of blood, I would give them blood to remember me by. With these ironical reflections, I took up a loaf of bread, broke it, and passed it to my disciples and told them to eat it. I likened the brokenness of the bread to the future brokenness of my body, and asked them to repeat this breaking of bread and distribution as a means of remembering the sacrifice of my body to bring them the truth about God and the truth about life, the truth about love. Realizing I was in a strange mood, they stopped eating, listened, took the bread, and ate it silently. Next, I took up my goblet of wine and passed it around, saying that they must each drink from it, for it was a symbol of my blood, which would shortly be shed because I had dared to bring them the truth of existence. I saw that the edge in my voice had reached some of them. Soberly, each one took a sip, and then passed the goblet to his neighbor, but still they said nothing. They sensed I was in earnest and would not tolerate any more argument. Then I told them that a certain man amongst them would betray me. Privately, I understood his motives and knew that he was a necessary part of the future sequence of events. He was but playing a role, which his nature had prompted him to do. I knew that he would suffer greatly, and I felt compassion for him, but these thoughts I kept to myself. When I mentioned that one of them would betray me, and told Judas to leave and do what he had to do quickly, the disciples came alive, wondering if this was really their last meal with me. Now there was a great deal of emotional distress, questions, even recriminations for having led them into such a trap. Again, they wondered what they would do with their lives after I had gone. They asked what kind of standing they would have in the community if I were crucified. They would be an object of derision, they argued. No one would ever again believe a word they spoke. Deeply saddened by their self-centered response to my predicament, I assured them they had no need to fear for their own safety. They would abandon me and would not be connected to my crucifixion. After my death, I suggested they should disperse and return to Galilee. This touched Peter deeply, and he reacted, vehemently denying that he would ever abandon me. But of course he did. All the love that I had felt for my fellow man, all that I had longed to accomplish for them, in this moment of my own need, still met with blank non-comprehension, even resistance. Their only concern was what would happen to them. There was no word of kindness, offering of help, anguish for my future ordeal. How hard was the human heart, I thought. How many weary centuries would pass before mankind would be able to move beyond their own hurt and pain to feel even a glimmer of love and compassion for other unfortunates in a worse situation than themselves. And so, although deeply disappointed, even hurt by their selfish reactions, I also understood them and attempted to give my disciples courage to face the future, and assured them that I would always be with them, even when I was hidden from their sight. The work I had started would be promoted from the life beyond. I would not leave them alone. They would know and feel my presence, and this would be a comfort to them. I told them to cling to their memories of my time with them. I warned that there would be many who would continue in the knowledge I had given them, but there would be outsiders who would seek to add the voice of tradition and reason to my teachings. My words would be so distorted that eventually they would no longer reveal the original truth I had brought to the world. When I told them that this would happen, they were upset, even panic-stricken. I was relieved to see that my teachings had not been in vain after all. They had not entered totally deaf ears. They asked me to tell them more, but I raised my hands and said that that was all I could say. At that point, I felt I had said all I ever wanted to say whilst on earth, that my speech with men had been accomplished. All I greatly, deeply desired was to retreat into silence and find peace and comfort in my contact with the Father. We left the supper room and walked to the Mount of Olives, but the mood of my disciples was one of inner conflict, fear, and doubt. Most of them left to join their families and friends who would still be celebrating their own Passover. In the garden, there was a special boulder shaped like a little cave. I liked to shelter in it from the wind, and so I sat and meditated and prayed, seeking a way into the exalted harmony I had enjoyed in the past. I knew that when I moved into attunement with the Father love, my fears would dissolve and I would be in a state of total and absolute peaceful confidence again. As I felt the power of love move into me and possess my human consciousness, so did the strength to endure what lay ahead possess my heart. I would be able to remain within the love and give the love to others to the very end. And so it was. I will not even attempt to re-enter into the trial and crucifixion state. It is of no consequence. When I finally died on the cross, and my spirit withdrew from my tortured body, I was lifted into ineffable and radiant light. I was enclosed in the warmth and comfort of love, such as I had never experienced before. I had a sensation of enveloping praise, a powerful assurance of work well done, of ecstasy in universal strength to continue the work, and joy and rapture which is far beyond any that the earthly condition can ever know. I moved into a new and wondrously beautiful way of life, but I still descended in consciousness to remain in touch with the people I had left behind. I was able to show myself to those who were sufficiently sensitive to be able to see me. However, the story of Thomas who supposedly fingered my wounds is nonsense. My disciples did not know that I had secretly arranged with Joseph of Arimathea to take my body to his own unused tomb after my death, where he would anoint it, according to custom, before the sun set. Then, when darkness had fallen and the Sabbath was being observed by everyone in Jerusalem, assisted by 2 mounted trustworthy servants, he would take my body secretly during the night and by out-of-sight tracks during the day to a mountainside outside Nazareth in Galilee. There, further assisted by my family, if he followed my directions, he would find a small hidden cave which had given me shelter from storms and a refuge from people when I was young, unhappy, and rebellious, and at odds with the world. Joseph promised to find the cave from a map I had given him, and to leave me there after further embalming. He would build up the small entrance to thoroughly block it from intruders. There, my body has rested, free from molestation. It has been said of me that my body rose from the dead. What an absurdity conjured up by earthly minds which were at a loss to satisfactorily explain my death as a felon on the cross. What need would I have of an earthly body to continue existence in the next dimension? How could such a ridiculous myth persist even into the 21st century? It has been a measure of the lack of understanding of Christians that they have blindly accepted such a dogma to this very time. Think about this carefully. Having been released from an earthly body, and after my experience of the ecstasy and glorious rapture of passing into a higher dimension of universal consciousness, why would I want to return to the earthly dimension to enter my body again? Of what use would it be to me in your world or in mine? Whilst the physical substance of my body might be spiritualized when perfectly attuned to the Father-love consciousness while I still lived on earth, would not my body be an encumbrance and a deterrent to my subsequent journeys within the highest spiritual kingdoms? Visible things are but a manifestation of specific frequencies of vibration in consciousness, which produces a shimmer of motes or particles, giving an appearance of solid matter. Each visible substance possesses its own unique vibrational frequency. A change in the rate of vibration produces a change in the appearance of matter. As consciousness energies change, so do the appearances of matter change. Therefore, it was possible for me to focus and lower my frequencies of consciousness to that point where my form became visible to the human eye. I could return to my disciples and be seen by them. And I did so. I loved them more than ever before, and owed them as much comfort and support as I was able to give them after my death. Not only this, it was necessary to direct my own power into their minds in order to give them the impetus and courage to continue the work I had started. However, I want you to know that the individualized consciousness, which has ascended in vibrational frequencies to the very portals of the universal creative dimension, becomes light individualized, an individualized consciousness which needs no body in which to express and enjoy all that the glorious consciousness can devise in the highest spiritual realms. It is a supreme and enraptured state of being, having none of the needs, desires, impulses experienced by those who have not fully mounted high, beyond, and above the ego. Whilst living on earth, your minds remain anchored within certain parameters of vibrational frequencies, imprisoned in bodies which have their own needs. If your consciousness were to truly soar beyond these parameters, your earthly self would disappear. When I was trapped in a body, I was also largely confined to these parameters of vibrational frequencies and consciousness. Furthermore, imagination alone can soar no further than your previous experiences, and therefore you are confined to your past, which you project into your future. However, little by little, you will be led by those minds which are sensitive enough to access the higher spiritual dimensions and can thus move beyond your present consciousness boundaries. They will record for you those wondrous experiences and states of being beyond your own, to which you yourselves will then be able to aspire. In this way, you go forwards in levels or steps of spiritual development. Each step brings you a higher vision of what can be achieved, and out of this vision you formulate a new goal. With this goal ever before you, you work to cleanse yourself of the contaminating influence of the bonding rejection impulses of your earthly existence. Step by step, you transcend your ego. When you transcend your ego and it dies within your consciousness, you are now abundantly alive within the Father Love consciousness and find the reality of the kingdom of heaven in your lives, within yourself, and in your environment. To enable you to reach these pinnacles of love, joy, harmony, and rapture, I lived, worked, and died in Palestine, and I have come to you now in these letters. Let not my work be in vain this second time. As you read these pages, seek, meditate, and pray for inspiration. You will come to feel the Father's response, and if you listen every day attentively, you will hear the Father's voice. This voice is ever with you. Dismantle the barriers created by self-will. Open yourselves to receive strength, power, inspiration, and love direct from the Father Love consciousness. Read and reread these letters, that they may eventually become absorbed into your consciousness. And as you do so, you will be journeying towards light, and you will radiate light to others. Such light is not just light as is electricity, but is the very nature of universal consciousness, which I described to you in my letter 1. Therefore, as you radiate the light, you will radiate unconditional love. You will promote the growth and spiritual development of every other living entity. You will yearn to nourish and nurture. You will work to promote protection and healing and education. You will long to assist in the establishment of loving law and order, in which all will be able to live harmoniously, successfully, and prosperously. You will be in the kingdom of heaven. At the same time, let there be no illusions. As steps are taken to introduce these letters to the outside world, there will be exactly the same recriminations, the same condemnation, the same talk of Satan, the devil, as there was when I first taught in Palestine. Take heart. Pray for courage. Those who endure to the end will rise above the turmoil and violence and will rest in the peace and joy of the kingdom.